We are here with Steve Curran, really good friend, longtime friends. You've seen him over the last couple emails, and we've been talking about leadership. And we wanted to just pull together a conversation, sort of off the cuff, about how all of those really good ideas play out in our actual ministries, our lives, and our leadership. And so we're going to do that today. Steve, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody and give us like the 30-second lowdown on where you are at in
Sure.
your life and ministry these days.
So, hey, I'm Steve. I was in the Navy for 23 years, retired as a chief petty officer, got to do some of the stuff you see on commercials, some of that fun stuff. One of the anecdotes around that is I got to be in a country that no longer exists. So, fun stuff like that.
That's
And
cool.
then made the very natural transition that everyone should make going from the military into full time ministry. And so was on staff at a large church in the Savannah, Georgia area with some amazing people there, overseeing everything in the adult discipleship world. The easy way for me to describe what I got to do was it wasn't worship, it wasn't kids, it wasn't students, and it mostly wasn't preaching. Everything else was at some point fell under my role and responsibility.
I used
So
to say
was
I
that
do all the non-Sunday stuff. That's kind of what it feels like, right?
yeah,
That's
yeah,
what do you run?
absolutely.
I run Monday through Saturday. Yeah.
That's right. I run the in between, right? I run the in between
Yeah.
Sundays.
Yeah. Love it.
And then just recently left the staff of the church, felt like God was leading me into a different direction. And now what I do is leadership development and consulting, helping teams and leaders figure out how to communicate better, how to grow their leadership, how to build out their leader toolkit. And so that's what I get to spend my days doing.
Love it. You've given me more informal. Well, it was very formal. You just didn't charge me money, which you should have. But you've given me more leadership guidance than most people in life in our random conversations throughout life. So I've loved getting to read the stuff you made for the Sherpa audience. And I would love to know personally for you, like you talked about this pastoral seas, sailing the pastoral seas versus sailing the leadership seas, and separating out this life of a pastor versus life of a leader, because we have to manage that tension all the time as leaders in churches. So what was easier for you? Was it sailing the pastoral seas or was it sailing the leadership seas? What was more natural, and where was the growth edge for you as you were coming up and switching into ministry, all that stuff?
Sure. Well, I think each has its challenges, each has its amazing parts, right? So I enjoyed both aspects of it. Leadership is probably easier. Easier is not the right word. More fulfilling for me because
Mm-hmm.
the people engaged wanted to be engaged, right? Were growth minded, wanted to make a difference. I know early on in my transition to ministry, I had a conversation with someone. They wanted me to, we were rolling out a digital curriculum system, right? So rather than books and DVDs, we're going to go to a digital streaming service. Well, not everybody was comfortable with it. And so I had someone come up to me and say, hey, will you come teach a class on how to use this new system? And me being in a leader mindset, I was
Yep.
like, how about you and I get together and then you can help anyone out at your campus that needs help with it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, that was not the appropriate response, apparently, because they said, they weren't interested in doing that. They wanted me to come out and do that. And my typical response, coming from a military mindset, was, well, if you're not willing to put effort into this, like, why do you expect me to put effort into it? I didn't say it in those words. However,
Mm-hmm.
the next week, uh, maybe not even the next week, I got a phone call that said, hey, we need to talk about how you respond to people. And I eventually wound up going out and doing that class. I never told anyone this, but I called the class in my head, The Internet is Good. Like I felt like that's what I was going out there to teach. The internet is good. Um, But so this idea of pastoral leadership and caring for people can be much more challenging because not everybody is on board or wants to be there, and it also has a weightier side to it, right? Where there's eternal differences here, whereas in the leadership arena, maybe not, but for most people who aren't in spiritual leadership, there's no eternal significance here, right? We may have long-term things, but it's not affecting anyone's soul. So really experiencing those two sides of it. The other aspect that makes pastoral leadership challenging is that everyone thinks they get the right to have an opinion because they go to church, right? So someone who has never had any iota of musical training, didn't take piano as a kid, didn't do any of those things, still thinks that they should be able to dictate how and what worship music happens in a church. Well, in a leadership arena, you have to demonstrate your competency before you get input into things, right? Nobody asks the person working at the drive-thru at McDonald's nobody in corporate at McDonald's is going, let's ask the drive-thru person who works part-time what our strategy should be for the next 5 years. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of where it went.
Well, it's interesting. I think what comes to mind is, is leadership something that pastors do? Like, is leadership the box of skills? And we have to be pastors who have a new box of skills and tools to lead well? Or are we leaders and we need to make sure we lead pastorally? Which one is the adjective in that case, or the adverb? Pastorally is an adverb. Yeah. Anyway, which one does that? What does that look like? And is it just case by case? And what do we have to be in essence versus what kind of, like, is leadership just a box of tools that we need to adopt and learn? Or does it work the other way around?
Steve, I wonder if you would agree with this. I feel like in some ways I was the flip of you in that I think I was most comfortable with the pastoral side, with the relationship side, with helping people through their crises, being there for them, teaching, this kind of thing. But very frustrated in that role because I wasn't seeing them take the steps to leave maybe the behaviors or develop the skills to leave the place that they were coming to me to get out of. And I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, and for those not familiar with that, that's an achiever. So when I started going to leadership conferences, reading leadership books, getting mentored by leaders on the leadership piece of ministry, that awakened that side of me. So I kind of came at it through the pastoral side, the people side, but it awakened that side of me because if I'm not leading people out of this, if I'm just being with them in it, which is very, very important, but if I'm not leading them out of it into someplace new, or developing the organization so it creates an environment and even systems and automates things so that those elevations can happen more naturally, then I was going to be very unhappy, and at times would become that if I did not get to add a strong leadership capability to my ministry profile. So I don't know if that resonates with you at all as far as what Tommy was just bringing up or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people skills and leading is a different skill set than pastoring, right? There's an aspect of pastoring that has leadership, but there are different skills and tools to use. One of the tools we use in the way when I do leadership development is called the support challenge matrix, and it's about figuring out how to calibrate high support and high challenge so that you're moving people forward. Most of us either lean into high support or high challenge. And so it's figuring out, okay, well, how do I intentionally do both of those? And if I were to change that and put that in biblical language, right? So most pastors and churches lean into high grace or high truth. But Jesus was both full of truth and full of grace. And so
Yeah,
it's being
100%.
intentional about, if I lean into grace, how do I make sure that I'm telling the truth and adding truth? And if I lean into truth, how do I make sure that I'm bringing grace so that
Mm-hmm.
I can be a liberator for people and be intentional about leading them? And so I think that's the struggle for a lot of pastors. And similar to your story, like they step into pastoring and don't have any framework for, what do I do to actually move people other than just be with them, pray for them, preach at them.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the whole skill set.
When and Greg, you said something. You talked about. I don't think you said the word scale, but you talked about systematizing, automating,
Mhm.
creating structure, process, which moves people, and leadership
Mhm.
is essentially helping somebody move, right? It's leading
Mhm.
them. What's interesting about that is it seems like the pastoral, what we usually do when we talk about pastoral skill set or dynamic is either, we talk about teaching, but that's really, there are plenty of people that are great at teaching and not good pastors, and
Yeah.
there's
Or not
differences
good
there
leaders.
too.
Teach great teachers and not good leaders
Totally.
too.
Yeah. So they're
Right.
all different buckets. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. That's very true. And we can't assume that the best teacher is the best leader, or like you don't want them sitting across from you in a crisis because they're going to teach you and you don't want to be
Mm.
taught in a crisis, all of that. So, all different buckets. But what's interesting is that leadership seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, the way that you scale up and multiply your efforts. Because it's not just that, how do I lead you one on one? That's an element of it, but it's also, how do I create next steps? How do I create processes? How do I create an ecosystem and all of these different ideas? How do I create all of this? That's, all the steps and programs and communication, all the things are working together and dripping with those same values. I don't have to be the carrier of the values. I actually helped instill those values in my volunteers, in the way that we ask you to take a next step at the end of that thing versus that thing. You said support challenge, and I thought, yeah, it's the same way as you don't ask a new guest to start tithing. You ask them to get a free gift at your one place in exchange for an email. And that's it. That's it. That's support challenge.
Mhm.
That's the best we can do for right now. And then at the next thing, you scale it up a little bit, but you also
Mm-hmm.
provide the right people alongside. So you're creating environments and creating communication and messaging, and you're instilling all these things in volunteers, and all of that seems to be those pieces of leadership in an effort to scale up that one-to-one interaction, because I can't pastor everybody. I have to teach other people how to pastor other people too.
And before you even talk system and before you talk tactics, I'd love to key off something you said, Steve, that for me, when we talk about say pastoring and leadership, and you also say grace and truth being, you know, uh, 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 different than what they are. I would underscore that, at least for me, what has been most helpful to me is to see them as distinct, because they are, but not separate.
Mm-hmm.
And what has helped me integrate them more into a whole is, ironically, it's the term that we translate into the word pastoring, and that's shepherding. Literally the word in Spanish or in Latin for shepherd is pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at a shepherd in any context, they're not just pouring oil on the sheep wounds, they're not just carrying the sheep, they are leading the flock to higher ground.
Right.
So when you read Psalm 23, you get a job description of a shepherd that is both leader and nurturer,
Mm-hmm.
that is both caretaker and ascender, or charge, a charge leader. And so I think if you look at the biblical mandate to shepherding, you're not going to get the American, I just teach the Bible and visit you in the hospital, pastor. You're not just going to get this choleric corporate leader who is trying to lead the organization toward a goal. You're going to get a shepherd who is leading individually and corporately everyone to higher ground and to where the best place is for them to thrive.
Mhm.
Yeah. No, I
And
think
I don't
that's
know
really good.
I don't know what that, if that even resonates in your journey or not, but that has helped me a bit in mine.
No, absolutely. I think that's really good. What came to mind for me is in that idea of shepherding, right? The shepherd leading the sheep to higher ground, to good pastures, to things that they know will help and benefit the sheep. Um, the sheep still has responsibility in there, right? To eat,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
To graze
And to not wander.
and to not wander, right? I lived in Italy for 4 years. Navy was great. I got to do that. And routinely, we lived in Sicily. Uh, Shepherds would be taking their flock across the road, and they'd be all around your car, and you just have to stop, and they just all kind
Mhm.
of travel together and journey together, right? Knowing that if I get separated from this, bad things are happening. I think one of
Mhm.
the struggles in the American way of shepherding, right? This idea of I'll just preach or I'll just teach them, and or even, and this is it may just be me, right? Probably because of where I got saved. This idea of your responsibility when it comes to evangelism is to bring them to church rather than
Mhm.
bring
Mhm.
them to Jesus, right? So I had the privilege of
Yeah.
being saved under an amazing pastor named Dr. D. James Kennedy at Coleridge Presbyterian Church. Phenomenal pastor. But
Yeah.
he started a program called Evangelism Explosion. There was training.
Right.
You learned two questions. We literally went door to door with someone who is training you
Yep.
to teach you how to share Jesus with somebody. And somehow we've gotten that confused with no, your role is to invite them to church and then let the professionals introduce them to Jesus. Well,
Mhm.
that's not that's not the biblical model. That's not what I see in scripture. And I think
Mhm.
that's the difference, or that's the struggle when it comes to leadership, how to scale, as Tommy was saying, how to pass that leadership on to go, your role is not just to be the sheep and follow the shepherd. Your role is also to
Mhm.
reach out to other individual sheep and bring them into the flock. And you don't need the shepherd to do that. You can do that on your own.
Mhm. Mhm.
And people are gifted differently, and some will have
Mm-hmm.
the gift of evangelism, and some will have gifts that really make them maybe not as articulate or more insecure at sharing things. But my, when you were talking, Steve, I thought about my favorite moment in our one program, which is called Next Steps at the moment at my church. It's in step 4 where we talk about unleashing compassion, and we talk about it in an Acts 1:8 kind of way that starts with your closest people around you, then it moves to the community and it moves to the world. And we never call it this, but it's basically evangelism training. But the way we do it is we showcase Revelations 12:11 that they, meaning first century Christ followers, overcame the dragon, meaning Satan and the world system at the time, with two stories: the blood of the Lamb, that's his story, and the power of their testimony, which is their story. And
Mm-hmm.
then we're real big on saying your testimony is not when you came to Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
unless you didn't grow up in church. I said, nobody cares about that story except your mama. But it is when did God first become real to you?
Mm-hmm.
That's where the money is. And we begin them thinking about that at step 1 so that by step 4 they get into pairs, and in 2 minutes they have to each share the story of when God became real to them. And then they switch. When it's done, there's tears flowing, there's people hugging. It's my favorite moment
Yeah.
in all of Next Steps. And then when it's done, we tell them this. Uh, so give us one word for how you felt when you heard the other person's story. And they can't come up with adjectives that are big enough. Inspired, amazed, moved, whatever, they just, all these things. Now, would you like the people closest to you to feel that way in relationship to God and the good news? And they all say, yes. I go, so do you think that they'd feel that way if you led them through a Bible study through salvation in the book of Romans? And they feel guilty going, no, you know what I mean? Like I have to let them feel freedom. And said, then don't. They didn't have Romans in the first century for a long time. And so they just shared their story and turned the world upside down. So go and ask God every day if that say I'm ready. You bring somebody my way, and I will share that story because you're the expert on that. You don't have to get trained for it. You don't have to get trained at all. But in that moment, I feel like the shepherding task converges and brings kind of melts a little bit the distinction between pastor and leader, and we just kind of unleash what they already have within them and then give them a challenge to pray that for 7 days, which we actually do, to set an alarm on their phone to remind them, God, I will share my story with anybody that you open the door with,
Yeah.
today, and watch what happens. But I think even when it comes to evangelism training, there's ways to express a melding of the pastoral and leadership gift to produce some fruit, hopefully,
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
people's lives.
No, I think that's a phenomenal example of calibrating support and leadership, right? We're going to give you
Mhm.
support and equip you so that you feel comfortable telling your story. We're going to give you an opportunity to tell it in a safe place. We're going to let you
Mhm.
practice.
Mhm.
And then we're going to give you the
Mhm.
challenge now that you're supported to go and do that, right? That's how you liberate people. That's phenomenal. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's almost like anytime we get the chance, like the highest level of leadership seems to be choosing to train instead of just teach.
Mm.
Hmm.
It feels like, right, because
Yeah.
you're always trying to replace yourself anyway. I heard a great term, and it was related to parenting, but I heard a great term recently that was self subverting authority. That the best parents practice self subverting authority, and it's really just a master apprentice style, anything, and it works for everything. But especially with the way of Jesus is, like, Jesus led his people and then he left because he said, "Yeah, you're good. Like, I'll send the helper, all of that, but like the way we take over the world is through you. Like, if I stay, it's never going to happen." It was him giving away all of his authority, and then at the right time removing
Mm.
himself and saying, "You're all good. You got this." And that's what parenting is. Like, the point is to launch them well and give them everything we've got before that point, not wait and hold it. And it seems like that's a huge part of leadership too. And you don't do that by just pushing them out of the nest at, you know, age nothing and saying,
Yeah.
"Look."
Well,
And so
I
we can't
think
just
that's
throw
why
people in,
I
but
think
it
that's
looks
why
like
the
training.
Proverbs I think that's why the Proverbs don't say teach up a child when they are
Yeah.
young, and when they're
Oh,
old they won't
duh.
depart from it.
Well, there
It
you
says
go.
train up.
Right.
So,
Absolutely.
Steve, what is for you when it comes to the work that you get to do training business leaders on the ground? You had a social media influencer for a while on the docket, which is fun, but she was leading a team, right? So it's everyday
Mhm.
people.
Yeah.
And what I love about this is you're not just training and coaching churches; you're coaching Christians in the workplace, which is actually who all of our us pastors get to also then think about. Like, the way that we train up leaders is then sending those leaders out because they're leaders elsewhere, so we got to teach them how to lead well. All of that, like, it's a big compounding effect. But what does that look like for you? What does it look like to teach out these skills and not just teach them but train them on the ground? So what are you doing with those leaders that we can replicate with the way we
Mhm.
lead? And also, what skills are most important and where do you go first? Like, the
Sure.
first, I mean, maybe it's the things that you put in that second half of the article, the leadership C's. You had some phenomenal, like, roles that leaders play. But what are the top ones, and how do they look? What do they look like practically when it comes to training the people in and on our teams?
Yeah. Well, so one, like, it's an honor and a privilege to get to work with the amazing people that I get to work with. God has been very generous with me and connected me to some phenomenal leaders. And I truly believe Christians should be the best leaders on the planet because we follow the best leader who ever lived, right? You talk about assimilation and evangelism and sharing your story, leading in a way that honors people and challenges them in appropriate ways and then points them back to Jesus is an amazing calling. And so I love that I get to do that.
Mhm.
I when it comes to how that works, right? The first thing is if you want to change a culture, you need to change the language, right? So language is what establishes culture. All of the cultures that we are a part of are built around common language, right? So it's figuring out a common, objective, viral leadership language, right? And I say this the same way every time I say it, which is we say the same things the same way every time we say them.
Right. Right.
Same things the same way every time we say them, so that the definition is very clear. This is what we mean by support and challenge. This is what we mean by your leadership voice. This is what we mean by building the core of your leadership. The second aspect of that is to use visual tools. So the 20th century model of leadership development is get their butts in a seat at a conference and then sell them a book. I've got a whole shelf of conference notebooks that I wrote amazing things down in those conference notebooks and never looked at that notebook again.
It's a lot of words, man. It's a lot.
And
of pages.
so the way to actually transform the way somebody leads is to make it visual, so it's memorable and portable and practical. You need to be able to use it right now. I'm old enough. Tommy might not be old enough. I'm old enough to remember when I was a teenager, I probably had 150 phone numbers memorized, right? Because I didn't have this device where I could pull up somebody's name. I had to type the numbers in on the phone.
No. Pause.
Yeah.
Actually 150?
Probably. It was
I
probably
don't have
close to that.
150 of anything memorized.
Because you don't have to.
Because you don't have to, and
Oh
that's
my
the point.
goodness. Wow.
I know
And you
3
weren't
numbers
using a
now.
rotary phone.
I feel
He wasn't using a rotary phone that
as an adult.
emphasized it physically every time you
That's
called
a good
it.
point. You know
Yeah,
what it feels like. You don't even know the numbers. You just know what it feels like. Yeah.
Right.
I could name right now, and I'm not going to, but I could say the phone numbers from when I was a kid of all my relatives, all my best friends. They're all still here,
Right.
and I haven't used them necessarily since my childhood.
Yeah.
I'm so impressed right now.
Now, the reason Tommy doesn't know any of them is because that's not practical for him. Right?
No.
Greg, you and I
As for us.
memorized them because it was practical. We used it right away.
Mhm.
And so leadership concepts or leadership principles that aren't immediately practical,
Right.
they're not going to work for adults. Right? They
That's
might work for
just in
kids
case
because kids
versus
learn because you tell
just
them
in
that's
time.
what they're
Yeah.
supposed to learn. So it has to be immediately practical. And then the process we use is first become a leader worth following, and then you can build leaders worth following. So we apply all of the tools to ourselves first, and then worry about how we're going to apply it to the people we get the privilege of leading.
That's awesome.
Sweet. So where do we start when it comes to becoming those types of leaders? Like because there was a minute in the church, like you mentioned the conferences and the books and all of it. There was a minute in the church. It's still probably going on, but that I experienced. And it was this kind of wave of everything is leadership. And it wore me out after a while because I was like, well, not everything's leadership. And it just broke down for me as, personal journey. But there was something there. So is there somebody to follow? Like, do we hire you? What do you do? How does it, where do we go? What are the best books? Who are the thought leaders? Like, where do you start with all of this? Because you can't just search leadership and then get something usable, because you get 87,000 things back. Well, that's actually on the light side, but where do we start in the journey?
Sure. So one, of course, hire me. No, I'm just kidding. I think you're right. Doing a random search of leadership, or how do I have a hard conversation, or how do I fire somebody, or how do I whatever, isn't going to lead to helpful things. And that's how most pastors deal with leadership development. Or it's, well, this is what the person I worked for did, and I'll either do that or I'll do the opposite of that. But it's whatever that person brought. And so I think the struggle for a lot of pastors is you go to seminary and you get training on preaching and teaching and prayer and spiritual development, and maybe something on fundraising. At least they should tell you about that aspect of it. And then if you're lucky, or there's one class on how to actually lead people.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you step into this environment and you've got a staff, you've got volunteers, you have people who are looking to you to direct them, to lead them, to tell them what to do, and you're left on your own to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what showed up for the church, was all of these pastors going, I'm having to figure it out on my own. So people stepped into that leadership vacuum. You know, John Maxwell's one of the originals that did that. I love John and I love his stuff. He does phenomenal things. But I remember John Maxwell talking, one of his talks was about, you need to preach on finances every January. And there are so many churches that that's an inviolate part of their calendar because John Maxwell said to do that. I actually think the right time to preach is in April, at least in the American church, because everyone's wallets feel empty in January after Christmas, but everyone's wallets feel full in April when you get your tax return. So I'm just saying, you know, if you're going to be strategic, preach then. But this idea of there is a skill set that's leadership that needs to be taught and talked about. And so I think we swung really hard in that direction because there wasn't anything. And
Right.
then we've had some public failures in that area, right? And I think that comes from, like anything in the church world, elevating the individual, elevating a system or a process over Jesus, and going, hey, I want to follow that leader because they're charismatic or because they've got a large following. Elevating numerical growth as a diagnostic tool for health, especially around leadership, is difficult and challenging. And so I think that's part of, and please hear me, I'm not saying you shouldn't grow your church. That's not what I'm saying.
No,
It's
yeah.
just this idea that if the church is growing, then we should do what they're doing, and that's not necessarily true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's always like when you think about numbers as a diagnostic, you think, okay, well, how do we train more leaders? And you go, okay, well, we train leaders, and then we have this many leaders in development, and this many leaders on the back burner, and this many leaders leading leaders, and we do all that. Like, what are they leading toward? That cliff over there. Well, so we don't want better numbers, right? Like, well, you know,
Right.
the numbers are great. Like, yeah, but there's a cliff, and you literally pointed them toward the cliff. So it really does depend on where we're leading them toward, and really who, but also the way. Like, the point of leadership is to mimic the way of Jesus, and so that's the whole point. And that's what I've always appreciated about you more than anything is you're like leadership guru and coach and like all of that, but that always is so obviously subservient to just the personal way of Jesus, and anything that rubs against that in any way, you're like, nah, that can't be right. So because we have a standard, and it's clearly set, and that's the like ultimate litmus test. It seems like.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
I
So-
love.
Oh yeah.
Go ahead.
No, you go. You
No,
go.
you- Well, so I was gonna talk about the Sherpa model, right? And this idea
Oh, yeah.
of Sherpas on Himalayas. So I use it in having a Sherpa mindset is necessary to grow as a leader. And the idea behind, you're not just pointing people up the mountain and saying, go there, right? No, you're climbing the mountain alongside them, in front, behind them, and traveling the journey with them, right? So that's the difference between leading from a worldly mindset of just go do what I'm telling you to do versus no, we're walking up this mountain together. I may know more, I may have done this before, but we're going to walk up this together because I'm also learning and growing as a leader. And if you talk
You know what?
go ahead. Oh,
Well, I was just going to say, in light of what you just said, my favorite image of a Sherpa that I use in my presentations is this real picture of a Sherpa, at the base of Everest with this huge retractable ladder on his back.
Hmm.
And because that ladder is there when they reach an impasse or a crevasse, he's going to spread that out across and they're going to get across it. He's going to get them across that barrier or that gap. And I just love that Sherpas are waymakers because they're doing it with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And I love that in a very American way. Americans who talk to Sherpas will say things like, well, how many times have you been to the summit of Everest? And a Sherpa's like, I don't know, a lot.
Who cares?
Because they've gone up and down to prepare the way. But a Sherpa will definitely know, but I helped 26 people summit last season. And so that's the idea behind leadership is I helped people get to the summit. That's the measure of my success. That's what it means to lead like a Sherpa.
That was gold.
That
was gold right there, everybody.
That sums it up. Well, that's we joked about this, but we could spend way too long on a call together, which we've done a couple times already now, and is really actually my relationship with both of you is let's plan a 20-minute meeting so we finish in an hour. And that's how we roll. But this has been fantastic. Steve, where can anybody find you, work with you, do whatever, like get more resources from you? What do you got available and how can they get a hold of you?
Sure. Well, one, thank you for the opportunity. This has been fun. Like I would sit and talk with you and Greg all day. We've joked about that, but
Yep.
this is I love talking about leadership stuff, and so this has been a great opportunity. If my company's called Khaki Consulting, so if you search khakiconsulting.com, it comes up. That has to do with the Navy. So when you're in the military, when you're in the Navy, when you make Chief Petty Officer, your uniform changes. It goes from a blue or a white uniform to a khaki colored uniform. That's the point in your career where you make the transition from being a great individual performer to being a great developer of individual performers. And so that's what I get to help leaders do. That's what I love helping leaders do. So if you search Khaki Consulting, you'll find me. My email is steve@Khaki Consulting. And then a great first step, if you email me or go to the website, you can take a free assessment to discover your leadership voice and start on your journey of becoming self-aware as a leader so that you can lead yourself better.
Love it. That's really cool. I had no idea that's why it was called Khaki Consulting. I figured it was because you looked good
Me
in
neither.
khakis. So that's awesome.
I mean, I do like
well,
a good
thank
pair of
you
khaki pants.
so much. Which works also. It's dual meaning. Thank you so much, Steve. This has been a blast. And I just can't wait to see what everybody gets to do with all of this and how we can all keep growing in our leadership. So appreciate you.
Thank you, guys. It's fun to be with you.